today's event is something of a public rarity in that we're bringing together the 4 regulators of social housing from across the UK together for a wide-ranging discussion about the future of regulation and where we are now. We'll be using this as an opportunity to hope to find out a little bit about what social landlords should be looking out for in 2021, and obviously how the ongoing pandemic is likely to affect the regulators' collective approach and approaches. I'll keep this intro brief because hopefully the juicy stuff is all going to come out in the discussion in a few moments' time, but we'll be certainly looking to get an insight into what should be top of landlords' risk radars in the different countries, and talking about issues such as resident involvement and scrutiny, fire safety, sustainability, and race and housing, a kind of a range of topics we'll also be looking to get into. We asked for audience questions on social media in advance, so I'll also be picking up on a selection of those as we move through. And hopefully the conversation will give us some insight too into how the regulators share learning with each other. So it's great to get this kind of dynamic and to get a bit of an understanding about how the regulators kind of pass on learning and strengthen each other's approach too. So we should get a little bit of an insight into how that kind of collective knowledge comes together. So yeah, if you're tuning in, you should get some practical takeaways for your organisation, along with a greater insight into the regulatory landscape for 2021. So before we move into conversation, all that remains for me is to introduce my guest today. We'll be speaking to, in rough alphabetical order, Michael Cameron, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Housing Regulator. And from Northern Ireland's Department for Communities, we'll be hearing from Anthony Carlton, Director of Local Government and Housing Regulation, and Trudy Crean, Head of the Housing Regulation Branch. We'll also be chatting with Fiona McGregor, Chief Executive of the Regulator for Social Housing in England. And our final guests today are Emma Williams, Director of Housing Regeneration with the Welsh Government, and Ian Walters, Head of Regulation Strategy and Policy. So yeah, well, welcome all. Thank you all very much for taking part today. And I think I'll kick off with some kind of fairly broad starters 10 before we get into some detailed policy area discussions. And I might just kick off with a question from the audience. I think the first 2 questions are going to be what's on the radar moving forwards, and feedback, what have you learned from last year? And we'll start off with a question from our audience submitted in advance, and it's from Carl Makin. Hi Carl, and he asked, what are the biggest risks in the sector right now? So I guess looking forward into 2021, what's kind of top of your radar, and yeah, how for an insight into how it might differ in each jurisdiction. So I'll probably stick with that kind of rough intro order. So Michael, I'll move to you first. What's top of your kind of risk radar at the minute?
Well, I guess in many ways the risks that we're focusing on haven't necessarily changed enormously since before March of last year. I think some of them have become more significant, more heightened, or landlords' capacity to mitigate or manage those risks may have been detrimentally affected by the impact of the COVID pandemic. So our principal risks that we focus on continue to be tenant and resident safety, homelessness, and rent affordability. Those are 3 of the biggies. So a range of other things that factor into those, and issues around governance and financial viability are always there on our risk radar. But those 3 are probably ones which I think have taken on added significance over the last 9 months or so.
Thanks very much, Michael. That's right, and certainly some of those areas we'll be kind of coming on and talking about in a bit more detail in a few moments time. Right, in terms of we've got Anthony and Trudy from Northern Ireland. And Anthony, shall I come to you first, and then Trudy, I might come to you in terms of the learning from last year as well. So Anthony, do you want to kick in?
Well, thanks very much for inviting us along. I think the much the same as Michael saying, the risks are similar but exaggerated. Our concerns, particularly for the incoming year, will be on the tenant side and the impact of social isolation and where we were in our customer surveys and customer care, we were seeing an increasing growth in the housing associations involving themselves in the broader client and customer care aspect, and you know, not just specifically of providing social service need, but also that sort of community type based approach that has really been upset. Social distancing, those are even in and out in the direction with some of the tenants. So I think, apart from all the other events going, that will be something that we'll be having a particular concern about, and how to try and get that back again once they say once we return to normality. But you know, once we're able to get people in and out of people's houses fairly regularly, or take tenants out and get them meeting collectively to start those sort of social interactions again. So I think that change is something that will be very big that we'll be looking at.
Sorry to jump in there, Anthony. I'm just wanted a kind of supplementary question, because we'll get to some of that in a few moments' time. But just in terms of that kind of insight for landlords, I mean, do you think that's something that they're ready for? Or what concerns do you have there? If you're a landlord tuning into this, basically, what should you be watching out for? What should you?
I think the pace at which the interaction stopped caught a lot of landlords, as it did with everybody, and landlords took a bit of time to, even in terms of readjusting, so their monthly meetings or any of those sorts of meetings were all online. Their maintenance programs were readjusted, so some very good innovative ideas were a lot of standard health and safety, checks on gas and electricity were undertaken electronically, or by way of using a camera and to see that everything's in order. That was very good. But the adjustment to bring back social interaction, the comfort of contact with others in a safe environment, I think it's going to be quite difficult for everybody, but particularly for in our view, for the associations when they look at their client base. So I think organizations and associations are starting to turn their mind now to what it will be like in 12 months' time.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. So, yeah, what does the recovery look like? Yeah. A really critical question for us to be getting into today, and what your role is in that. Trudy, I'll probably come to you when we come back down the line with the question about what we've learned from the past year. So if we can kind of pick up on that, just so we make sure we kind of get as many questions in as possible as well today. So Fiona, I'll move to you next, and then the question I'll come back to you with, Trudy, is probably what you learned from last year, and then your approach this year. Yeah, Fiona, what's kind of top of your radar? A lot of change on the horizon. So yeah, talk us through that.
Yeah, very definitely. So Martin, I mean, I think there's a bit of a risk we're all going to say very similar things, because we're all kind of the focus is making sure that tenants are in homes that are safe, as well as good quality, and actually that services are good. So in terms of given priorities for us for this year, I think absolutely the top of our list, and indeed it should be at the top of providers list, is building safety. It's a big issue at the minute in terms of profiles and affected by geography. Building safety, absolutely right at the heart of this. Sticking with the kind of economic side of things, I think, as Michael said, some of the the risks haven't changed, but the approach to them or the intensity of them might have changed a bit. So we're always interested in how well development and sales risk exposure are being managed. So not taking your eye off the ball and things like that, but actually taking account of the social housing white paper, which, as you rightly say, going to make a really big change for us as regulator, but I think it signals a really kind of clear direction of travel for the sector. And I think if you were to try and sum that up, I would say it's about making sure that as boards, providers are putting tenants at the heart of everything that they do, that they really are kind of focusing on what matters for tenants and to tenants. I think that's worked well during the lockdown, but if I was to sum it up, one of the things we've talked about for a long time, pre-pandemic and indeed pre-white paper, is just, quality of your stock, your existing stock. Are you investing enough in your existing stock and making sure that it's to a good standard? And there's possibly a separate set of questions about quality of new build, which speak a bit to the building safety point. But also, I think we've seen, without getting into lessons learned too much at this stage, I think we've seen a really kind of clear-eyed focus, as I've said before, on tenants and residents during the pandemic, and not losing that focus on tenants and residents, whether it's kind of livelihoods, supporting those who've lost their jobs, accessing welfare benefits for the first time, but also the isolation, vulnerability, the amount of work and effort that has gone in, I think, to trying to engage meaningfully with tenants and residents and reaching out to those who might feel isolated, I think has been pretty admirable, and not losing that, once we get through the pandemic. I think those would be the priorities.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Really interesting. It's interesting that certainly that's something that all of you have been talking about so far. And I think one of the questions, that kind of issue about putting residents at the heart, something that's come through quite a lot on social media. So there's quite a few questions along those lines, I guess, about what that might mean or look like. So we'll come back to that in a few moments' time. Thank you very much, Fiona. Emma, there you are. Sorry, lost you on screen. Emma, same question to you. What's top of the agenda for you? And I guess with that kind of you focus on landlords who are tuning in. So what should their ears be pricking up at? What really should they be looking out for, and how should that be affecting their approach?
Okay, thanks very much. Morning, everybody. I think we share many of the views that have already been expressed. The focus on homelessness, the importance of home has really been highlighted over this pandemic, both in terms of ensuring that everybody has access to a decent quality home, but also what people need and expect from their homes. I think there's been a change, and landlords need to be reflecting on that in terms of future need and meeting future need, but also very much in terms of the tenant support. We've seen some incredible partnership working. We've seen some incredible efforts to engage with tenants, to support them, and to find creative and innovative ways to do that. And I guess in terms of a risk, one of the risks that would concern me is that we still hold on, and we still use this phrase of when things return to normal. And actually there are a lot of aspects of business that I don't want to see returning to where they were before. I think we need to capture the innovation that we've seen, the willingness to collaborate in new and innovative ways. If we don't capture that and really build on that, then actually we will go backwards rather than actually being able to embrace some of the good things that have come forward over the last 10 months.
Just to jump in there, Emma, what are your fears about you talk quite broadly there about it, but what are your fears about what could be lost? What's the danger, if you like? And if you're a provider, what should you be looking out for to avoid doing that?
So I think we've seen great efforts to engage and support tenants in, all of our landlords have supported tenants all the way through. But actually what we've seen is a real step up in some of that activity for lots of landlords. I don't want to see that pull back. We've seen flexibility of our workforces, either across organisations or within organisations. And I think that's good for individuals working in those organisations, but it's also good for tenants and tenant services in terms of that flexibility and being able to respond to changing needs. Things like that I really want to see us capture and build on for the future. That sort of whole tenant view, rather than worrying about the aspects of a tenant's life most close to the core business, if you like, that recognition of the need to support tenants in a much broader sense across their income, work, etc., that many landlords do really, really well and did before. But we've seen that really increase and the importance of it increase. And I think particularly when we look at RSL's role in terms of supporting homelessness and ensuring that we are using every single stock item that we've got out there to make sure that people have a good roof over their head. That tenant support is absolutely vital, because if we are going to set people up for success, bringing them into homes and ensuring that they thrive in those homes, then actually the physical building is only a very small part of it. That tenant support and engaging with other services is absolutely key to making sure that people thrive in their homes.
Thanks very much, Emma. Really interesting, and I think given that a lot, I think almost everybody's talked about support and I guess what the future might hold. I think that's definitely something we'll get into as part of the discussion moving forwards. Yeah, before we again get into some of those detailed discussions about particular topic areas, I'll just ask a couple more people about learning from the last year as well. Obviously, it's been a very tough year. There's been a lot of change, both in terms of organisations, but also obviously in terms of society, which we talked about a bit there. And I'm just after, just in terms of a bit of an insight from the regulators, in terms of what have you learned from last year? How's that going to guide your approach in the year to come? So yeah, what's changed your thinking in the last year, and in a very volatile environment? Yeah, how's that going to inform what you do moving forwards?
Yeah, I think, I suppose, like everybody else, and the big issue that we have taken away from it is looking more for increased flexibility, and as colleagues have said, looking to maintain that going forward. Where even in terms of when you inspect, you go to board meetings and you're looking for a certain sequence of events happening. What we have picked up a bit more is, well, the sequence of events isn't as important as the outcome, what the delivery is, and has encouraged us to be take a more for us a flexible approach to the associations, and saying, well, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And not quite, we don't care how it's done, but more focus on, fine, if you're going to do it in manner A, then we have to be happy enough that that's delivering the outcome, as compared to trying to get that consistency that previously was there. So for us, I mean, it's both looking for and encouraging the flexibility in service delivery.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Truly, I'm going to give you a try now. You've got the headset on.
Yes.
So Anthony was just talking about that flexibility. What's your learning about from last year? I mean, what would you do differently, perhaps, and how will that inform your approach moving forwards? And if it is about flexibility, what does that mean for landlords? How will they see your service differing this year compared to last year?
Well, I think one of the things that I really wanted, that I've really noted the importance of this year is contingency arrangements and business continuity, ensuring that those are in place and that you've tested them and that they work well. So, I think in Northern Ireland, we're quite impressed by how social landlords have risen to the challenges. But I think you can't overemphasize the importance of, your business continuity plans and contingency arrangements.
Sorry, I agree entirely. I know I'm going to say it's a slight smirk, but there's nothing like a worldwide pandemic to test your business continuity plan, So it's anybody who said desktop, you said, well, actually, here's an actual worldwide pandemic. Let's see how it works, So
well, let's pick up on that point, and we'll keep that focus on what you've learned. So do please feed that in. Let's talk about landlords as well. What did landlords get right, and what perhaps do they have to learn from? Are there any kind of key areas of concern when it comes to landlords? Talked a bit about kind of planning in terms of what the future might be when it comes to kind of tenants and protecting tenants, but a number of issues there. I mean, I think November's report by the Regulatory Board for Wales said the board would like to see improvements in aspects of governance, health and safety, risk management, and financial planning in particular. So what areas do you want to see improve, if you like? What's your focus going to be? So I will come back to Wales in a minute, having mentioned that, but where am I going to go? Michael, it's been a while since we spoke to you. I'll probably go Michael, Fiona, and then raise that kind of those issues that I just raised. So Michael, over to you.
Sure, and I think picking up on some of the points that were already made, I think it was Emma that said about the spotlight that's been shone on the importance of home, and I think that's really come forward for me, and indeed the echoing what a number of others have said about social landlords stepping up in the crisis and doing so very early, mobilising quickly to support local communities and some of the most vulnerable people in local communities, and providing a range of services that went well beyond the core services of a landlord. And there's a question in my mind about whether there will be an appetite or an expectation that some of those roles and activities will be maintained, and what does that mean for how landlords set themselves to deliver that wider range of activities, and indeed how much of this often does come back to funding and money. How is that paid for? Is that tenants that pay for that? Is that something different? One of the things which I think has struck me, and this was always probably the case, but it's become far more evident during the last 9 months or so, and that's the reality that for many communities, social landlords are the only institutional presence. They're the only players in those communities of any great note or significance, and that presence is really central to the resilience of those local communities. And there's something in my mind about how we operate, how policy shifts to help support landlords in that kind of critical community anchor role. And while that might not necessarily be something which is the direct focus of most of us in the roles of housing regulators, there's a question as to whether it now needs to be more central to our thinking.
And is that something that you think that the regulators kind of set up to do? How does that mean you might your approach, I guess? I mean, you're talking about something that I guess is a role that landlords have played, like you say, for many years. But certainly a kind of running discussion over the years I've been about housing is this idea of almost mission creep, if you like, taking on stuff that isn't really your responsibility because nobody else is doing it. To what extent is that something that the regulators should have a view on? If so, how's that likely to play out?
And that's a big challenge for regulators, because in effect regulators look at what obligations are placed on landlords and whether they're meeting those obligations. The range of services that landlords deliver go beyond the obligations that are placed on them by statute or by agreed statutory-based standards. So there's a question as to how regulators acknowledge and reflect on those wider roles that landlords play, even if that's not necessarily the role that's been set by a regulator to monitor and assess and report on their delivery of those types of roles that go beyond that central core landlord activity. So there's a question in my mind as to whether there's a broader recalibration of the expectations and what that means for how we then go forward in regulating.
I mean, that's really interesting. I think that's a whole conversation in its own right. And Fiona, I might move to you with your thoughts on that, and also some of those questions about what landlords might want to learn from. But I think it's really interesting that discussion, just to try and continue that a little bit as well. I mean, certainly from some of the landlords I've been speaking to, the one that sticks in my mind from just before Christmas, looking at what the future of a housing association should be in this case, and they very starkly, the chief executive said to me, from the figures we're seeing through, we think our number one goal is to feed people. That was kind of how they saw their business developing in the future, and what their kind of prime need for them in the society they were operating in would be. What does that mean for landlords? And Fiona, to what extent is that something that the regulator will look at, be aware of, have conversations about? Where does the regulator fit in that world?
Yeah. And so Martin, if I can, let me just give a couple of reflections on what it means for landlords. And I'll try not to repeat what others have said. But I mean, the points that people have made about that flexibility and ability to actually pivot the business very, very quickly and pretty effectively, and do things in different ways, but really focus on, if nothing else, getting the basics right. And we've seen that come through in the surveys that we've been doing on operational response. So I think not losing any of that. And Emma talked about not returning to normal. And I think I hope nobody's going to return to the old normal without it being a cliche. It's what does the new normal look like? And there is a bit of how do you kind of capture the best of what we've learned during lockdown, but also kind of hold on to things that were important that we've lost for a bit. So I mean, I'm sure we would all say this. I think everybody's missed elements of face-to-face contact, and there are times where that brings real benefits. And Anthony said this, we do our IDAs remotely at the minute. There's no substitute for occasionally being in the room and watching the body language. And at a board meeting, it will tell you an awful lot. And so there are, it's a kind of
the landlords prefer it.
I don't care. But there is a kind of you learn different things from kind of different approaches. So I think in terms of learning the lessons for landlords, and a little bit from us as well, we will be really interested in, I think, what have landlords and what are boards looking at from as lessons learned from the pandemic, and how are they going to take that forward? This is about them and their organisations. And I think we're also interested in just resilience. How much of this can you keep doing? How much, how much more could you take? And that will be different for different organisations, different landlords, different geographies, different communities, different kind of sort of business models. So I think resilience matters, because this has been quite a hard slog, definitely for tenants, but also for staff. It's been hard work. Everybody's kind of really worked hard to kind of get this right, but it does take a toll. So I think we're interested in resilience. And in terms of the kind of questions of what does that mean as a regulator, and the whole mission creep approach, and it's really interesting. I mean, you can hear this in the discussion. Each of the four of us do have slightly different formal remits, and that might come out further in questions later on. And you have to always start with what is your formal remit, because otherwise, you're on a hide into nothing if somebody wants to challenge you and you're kind of completely overstepping the mark. But I do think that for us in England, the social housing white paper does give a really clear kind of indication of the importance of registered providers in that kind of community placemaking, almost anchors. It doesn't say it in those terms, but the kind of range of things that the white paper covers around antisocial behaviour, around domestic abuse, around what does the environment look like. I think the white paper gives you a really clear direction of travel on that. And from our perspective as a regulator, I think that translates into what is the board doing to meet those kinds of aspirations. I don't think we would want to get into territory, and this is the kind of whole sort of regulatory point and outcome focused. We wouldn't want to get into the territory of saying you should be doing X, you should be doing Y, but it's how do you reflect on what do your tenants, how do you engage with your tenants? What do they tell you they want to, and how does that translate out into the wider community? And our questions as regulator, I think possibly for all of us, but certainly for us, is about the quality of the board's thinking in this space, as opposed to, this is the thing you're missing and you're not covering, and why aren't you covering it, kind of thing. So I think that's really important. The one other thing I would say, just in terms of reverting to sort of, or what does a new normal look like, two other things. The first is, I think there's been huge benefits in that engagement side of things, of being able to reach a much wider range of people who might not have the courage to turn up at a kind of formal meeting and sit in a room round a big table, but will speak out on something that's more familiar to them, you know, whatever. So I think you just won't be allowed, landlords won't be allowed to lose them. And then I heard an absolutely brilliant quote, which was, "Never again will tenants believe that that's too difficult, it will take a long time. We'll get back to you in 5 years," kind of thing. People pivoted more or less overnight. You've built some expectations. You're not going to, tenants aren't going to let those go again.
Really interesting. We'll kind of pick up on some of that moving forward, and I think certainly a discussion like this would have been more difficult previously as well. Ian, I'm going to bring you into the discussion if that's okay. That kind of similar question about I guess that kind of areas of concern for the year ahead, and perhaps I might just stop briefly on the here and now as well. I mean, because we hear about landlords, struggling to maintain services really due to staff shortages right now. I mean, is that something that's on the kind of radar? How problematic is that? And what kind of feedback are you getting from landlords about just keeping their existing statutory, never mind where they might want to go next, their existing statutory services and responsibilities operating? So Ian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Just prior to this conversation, actually, I was in a meeting with board members, a board member forum, and again, that was one of the questions about the difficulties that organisations are having maintaining kind of compliance with health and safety, providing routine repairs and all of those things. But what is remarkable is the way that organisations have flexed, as other people have said. I think you can't kind of look forward and look at the forward issues without thinking about kind of the here and now. But I think what the pandemic has said to us really and reinforced to us is just how important the home is, and the role of social housing, as other people were touching on, Fiona, in terms of the community and the added value services, if you like. And I think our thoughts are turning to, as a regulator, really just thinking about, from our point of view, risk and materiality of issues, what really matters, which is work that we've been undertaking over the last kind of year or so in terms of our regulatory assessment model and a new model that we're bringing up. But the real concerns at the minute are things like staff burnout and the pressure on staff, as people were saying. Very, 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 very difficult for organisations to maintain the services that they are doing, albeit that they're doing a remarkable job, I think. There's lots that we need to understand and to think about from a regulatory perspective. Again, picking up on others' points about the longer term impact on tenants and service users, as the pandemic has no doubt changed expectations, as Fiona said. Nothing should be too difficult moving forward. The needs and demands and how RSLs respond to those challenges, I think, is something that we as regulators need to be thinking about right now, and shaping in conjunction with the sector, working with the sector on, how we might think about that moving forward.
And just in terms of that moving forwards, I'm just going to kind of detour for a second, and Emma, I'll bring you in if that's okay. I mean, both, I think an acknowledgement both Wales and England for starters about inconsistencies between the regulation of housing associations, local government sectors. What's the kind of message there, and what should the whole sector, if you like, be looking out for? So Emma.
I think the first thing I'd say is that over the course of the last 10 months, I think we've broken down a lot of barriers between different social landlords. So we have a much closer relationship between local authority landlords and local authorities generally and RSLs. And that's been a real positive over the last 10 months, and one that we want to capture and carry forward. Our framework review that has been delayed because of the pandemic, but is now starting to gain traction again, will look very specifically at the role of tenants in the framework, and actually to what degree the current framework and a future framework might need to reflect a different relationship with tenants and a different importance on tenant services within the overall regulatory framework. So that's a fairly big piece of work for us. I think that we're also keen to progress the work that we set out last year around looking at what we're deeming domain regulation. So actually looking at how we bring local authorities into the mix and look at their tenant services in the same way as we look at RSL tenant services to create greater consistency across the two sectors. So lots of work that was in hand pre-pandemic, if you like, or on the stocks, that has been naturally delayed, but we are now starting to take that forward. And hopefully, I think we will be able to benefit from what we've learned over the last 10 months in both of those pieces of work, and they will be strengthened as a result of the experiences.
Really interesting. And Fiona, I'm just going to bounce to you with that very quickly, if that's all right as well. I mean, certainly, speaking to a local authority housing figure again just before Christmas, said that it's going to be a bit of a shock to the system for many councils, local housing provision in a variety of different ways. Is that an accurate summary? Do you think? What should they be bracing for?
I think it's certainly accurate for some local authorities. So I think Martin, I mean, local authorities, I hope they all know this, are already covered by the consumer standards, even though we've got a reactive role at the minute in enforcing those standards. And you'll have seen, if you've read the Consumer Regulation Review from last year, which covered the previous year, pre-pandemic, that actually there was quite a significant increase in the number of reg notices issued to local authorities. I take that as a really good sign, because I think what we were seeing is we were putting quite a lot of focus into building awareness of us and our role amongst local authorities, and as a result we were getting more self-referrals from local authorities. It might have led to a reg notice, but that's a good thing that they're kind of, this is now more on the radar. There's a lot more, we need to do a lot more work to make sure that that is maintained. We've already been kind of reaching out to local authority groups. I think there's a wee bit of an echo somewhere, so sorry about that. So we've been reaching out to local authorities, to representative bodies, trying to really get ourselves on the radar. And as we consult about the implementation of the white paper and that more proactive consumer regulation role, and we really will want local authority input to that. And I think the bottom line is, and this is very, very clear in terms of government thinking behind the white paper, and therefore what we will be looking for as we roll out implementation, is you shouldn't get a different service as a tenant. If it doesn't matter who your landlord is, whether it's a local authority, whether it's a more traditional housing association, whether it's a for-profit registered provider. Hang on a second. Sorry.
Welcome.
Thank you. You might need to edit that bit. Sorry. Thanks. This happens every time.
The rest of us wondering where's our coffee.
I'm really sorry about that. It just happens quite regular. So I think you shouldn't get a different service. Regardless of who your landlord is, you should be getting the expectations, the outcomes should be similar, and that's what the consumer regulation is trying to do now, but significantly more so once we move into that more proactive space. But Martin, you're right to highlight. I'm not sure everybody's quite there yet. I don't think every local authority in the country quite gets this yet. We'll have work to do, but they'll get there. And certainly whenever we do engage at the minute, there is no lack of willingness, particularly on the things that we tend to find breach on now, which is around the home standard and particularly health and safety. You know, if there's an issue, local authorities always want to address that. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, clear message there. I'm going to move, and Michael, I'll come back to you now if that's all right. I mean, when we went out to the audience, so for on social media last week for questions, so I'm getting a bit of feedback, apologies. Consumer standards, the responsiveness of regulators to tenants' priorities came over quite strongly. And there's a question from Ross Fraser, hi Ross, about how in the absence of a national tenant voice in any of the 4 countries, regulators will involve tenants in the formulation of their policies on tenant involvement and scrutiny, pre-consultation. And similar question from Carl Makin about influence that tenants have in deciding what is and what isn't a risk. So I want to kind of come to that side of things, because we've been talking about that quite a lot, really, around that subject so far today. And also this kind of the idea of how you all share learning as well. And Michael, one of the reasons for coming to you with that question, yeah, if you could answer those questions, that would be great. But certainly, you know, in some of those conversations, what's been flagged is that people think that the Scottish Housing Regulator perhaps has a reputation in terms of the consumer regulation for doing it, you know, relatively well. So yeah, I just wonder how some of that learning might be shared as others expand their remits as well.
Yeah, and that learning and sharing goes on a continuous basis. You know, we all talk to each other in different forums and in different ways. So, and I think we all, Fiona mentioned, we all have different starting points in terms of our statutory setup. We've been delivering in our current model now for nearly 9 years. That has been with a particular focus on what others refer to as consumer standards. We talk about the Scottish Social Housing Charter and standards and outcomes that landlords are expected to deliver for tenants and other service users. And we've had a proactive regulation of that. And our approach for the last 9 years, and it's developed over that time, has been to empower tenants to be able to hold their landlords to account directly. So it's about us giving good information out to tenants and service users on how their landlords are performing, and giving them that information in a way that they can use to have meaningful discussions with their landlords. Alongside that, we've worked as hard as we possibly can to ensure that we understand the priorities of tenants and service users. So we have it's now a long-established national panel of tenants and service users. It's about somewhere between 400 and 500 tenants and service users that engage with us regularly to help us understand what their priorities are, what are the issues that might be causing them most concern, and we publish regular reports that come out of our work with the national panel. We also have a tenant liaison group that's drawn from the national representative bodies for tenants, and we involve tenants in our work. We have a panel of tenant advisors who will engage directly in our regulatory activity, our scrutiny work with landlords. So that type of approach allows us, hopefully, to be fairly confident that we understand what the priorities are for tenants and what some of the challenges are for tenants in terms of being able to understand what the landlord performance is and to engage meaningfully with their landlord. So a range of different things. Now, we've had various conversations with, I think, everyone around the table about those kind of things, and people have different approaches, and we've been able to pick up on ways that we might be keen to look at from others. And I think those learning conversations go on continuously. And while we do have all slightly different requirements placed on us, a lot of the core stuff remains the same. So we are able to ensure that we can take the best from what everyone's doing.
I think that's been really interesting, actually, the degree of consensus, certainly around some of those core issues, and where it shifted to around the table today, I think has been really, really interesting. Emma, I mean, you were again talking about change that's coming. Where are you looking, both perhaps around the other regulators here today, but I think kind of references the need to learn from Europe and more widely as well. Where do you kind of look and go, they're getting it right? Or what are you looking to kind of co-opt?
Not wishing to repeat, but as Mike says, you know, we talk to one another, we learn from one another, we learn together, which I think is even more important than learning from one another, and we share on a regular basis. So I think that relationship across the 4 regulators is really strong, and we hope it continues. I mean, obviously there are obvious areas that at the moment we are looking to learn from experiences of other regulators, particularly around the local authority, tenant services, and how that experience has played out in different places, as that's a hot topic for us at the moment as we're looking at it as part of the governance review, as I mentioned. I think in terms of tenant engagement, you know, there is a lot of good practice, not just across regulators, but actually it's really important that we look very widely at different organisations and how they engage, and importantly at how they engage with the most difficult to reach communities and individuals, because those are the voices that really are the most important, if you like. Those tenants who are most able and most willing to engage, those voices are important, but they reflect one side of the tenant experience, and actually getting that range of experiences from tenants is really important and much more difficult, frankly. I mean, we're aware our regulatory board tenant participation report flagged the potential need for a national tenant voice. We have a good working relationship through TPAS here in Wales. They provide regular reports to our board, and they carry out regular surveys. And it's interesting their learning over the course of the pandemic in terms of how they continue and build on that engagement, because it has become much more important for us all. So I think, you know, continuing what we're doing in terms of our collaborative approach. You know, in Wales, we're a great nation of people willing to chat, willing to share, and willing to work together. But it's really refreshing that actually amongst the regulation community across the UK, that's very much reflected. I think we work very well together.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I'm going to come to you very quickly on that, and then I'll get a couple more questions in. So yeah, Anthony, your thoughts in terms of who you're learning from, and also again, it's something that come out through this conversation time and time again, and was very prevalent in social media in the build up to this. So how you make sure that you involve tenants in the formulation of your own policies, as well as making sure that landlords are doing it well.
Well, I think to answer the first part of it, we do have regular as one could be. I mean, I think the last time we got together was in Belfast, and we had great plans to get over to Wales the next time, but so we'll have to do that virtually here. So, and you know, Trudy and our staff are regularly in contact with colleagues. So because there are common themes, it's always helpful that we're learning to see from each other. You know, are there any particular experiences that we need to pick up on? We do have, as Fiona said, and everybody else said, a different statutory base. You know, and as we always like to say, you know, and we're different here in Northern Ireland in so many respects. But one of the issues that we will be focused on now, and there will be a greater engagement, is the Minister for Communities here just earlier on announced a significant reform of what's called the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. It is, in theory, the equivalent of the local authority housing association, and that will change over the next few years. So that would be our largest landlord by quite a distance. So those reforms will now be starting to come in, and we will be looking to see how regulation sits within that. So that's where we'll be in more contact with, again, with various regulators who are used to dealing with landlords of, I mean, they're probably 4 times the size of our biggest current registered social landlord, you know. So that those are aspects where we see further reform going on. The other aspect, particularly, and I'll just go back to one of the earlier questions about what you would like to see develop, and I think as regulators, well, not as the regulator here, certainly in Northern Ireland, you look to obviously the statutory, this is what must be done, and then we look around at others and think it would be really good if you were to do this, you know, it would, and that's the bit that's, you know, we're always struggling with. Look, it'd be really good if we did this. You know, so those are the sorts of things, and we have a very strong community background, community infrastructure in Northern Ireland. The one thing I would like to see from housing is cooperation with others. You know, because the home, and if we can really eradicate homelessness, then everybody has a home, and therefore that's the starting point, in my view, for the other services.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I'm going to bring you in, and I'm also just going to throw in very quickly one other issue, which is something that I think a number of you have been raising in your reports recently. Hasn't particularly had necessarily the profile of understandably, perhaps, given everything else that's going on. But I know certainly in Scotland, in England, there's been the Scottish Housing Regulator writing to RSLs warning about notifiable events in relation to fraud, financial stakeholders concerned about increased prevalence of problems there, number of you know, high-profile attacks recently in England, flagged in Scotland as well. I might just before I move to Fiona on that as well, just a quick show of hands. Is this a big issue for everyone? Is everybody seeing kind of an increase in issues being reported there? So kind of raise hands if yes, if that's okay, just to get a bit of a feel. Oh, maybe not. So maybe not such a big issue. But Fiona, your thoughts on that? Is this a big issue for the sector moving forwards? And then definitely in terms of consumer regulation, just some insights into where you're looking to learn from, and also some of the concerns that have been raised about, as you look to expand the remit, do you actually have the resources to do that effectively? How do you balance your own resourcing?
Yeah. Okay, so Martin, I'm kind of conscious of time, so I'll try not to take too long. In terms of notifiable events, you know, has there been a marked increase? Well, the short answer is no, but it's gone from kind of 0 to a very small number. So, you know, I don't know if that makes it a significant increase or not, but you know, there is definitely a bit more. So it's kind of worth just saying that. And I think, you know, if that looks like anything like a real trend, you'd want to flag that in kind of risk profiles, you know, making sure those public messages going out, all of those things. In terms of the stuff about, you know, engaging with tenants, developing our new framework, and actually learning from others, I'll take it in 2 parts. I think the first thing in terms of engaging with tenants about how we do develop the new sort of consumer regulation regime, the first thing to say is we're not starting from a completely blank sheet of paper. We already have and have had for years, long before my time, a combination. We've got the tenant representative bodies. Some of them have been mentioned already, but we've got 3 of them join us on our kind of sounding board, which is a kind of wider panel. And then we have previously quarterly meetings. They're now stepping up in frequency with the tenant representative bodies in any event. But we're also working really hard, and will continue to kind of do so, to kind of reach beyond that, speaking to, we're doing loads of speaking engagements, actually, increasing number of different groups of tenants, whether it's local authority tenants, whether it's providers bringing them together, the representative bodies bringing them together, that raising our profile in that way. But Emma talked about one of the things we are acutely conscious of as we kind of develop the new framework and potential new standards is how do you get to the harder to reach tenants? How do you get that underrepresented voice to be heard? And we'll learn from everybody on this call, and I'll talk about that in a second. We will get actually formal advice. I mean, we're going to, we'll get some advice from consultants who do this kind of thing, to really kind of try and make sure we're getting a balanced set of voices being heard. It's really important to us. Don't underestimate the difficulty, but it is. And we'll do the same as we actually get into implementation mode, when we are at the point where we're rolling out the inspection regime. We work a lot on assurance from landlords, the whole co-regulatory, outcome focused approach. But we will want to triangulate that in our new consumer role and for inspections with tenants themselves, and they will not be hand selected by the provider, and they won't be the usual voices. So we'll look at that. In terms of learning lessons from the others, we talk all the time, as people have said. We have formal meetings, we have informal discussions. I'm pretty sure we all read each other's reports pretty avidly to pick up learning points. We certainly do that and do the analysis of it. And on specific areas, and I'll kind of highlight one in particular. I mean, I think it was about a year ago, knowing that the white paper was coming, knowing that one of the things that's really important as a starting point from us, it's a jumping off point rather than a kind of end in itself, was how we would look at what are now called tenant satisfaction measures. We were talking about them as KPIs at the time. We were really conscious that Scottish Housing Regulator is the one that's done a lot of work in this area. So there was a bit of a kind of delegation from us, went up to Scotland to talk in a huge amount of depth and detail, and we got massive benefit out of it to the Scottish Housing Regulator. And it was probably our most popular kind of thing in terms of staff wanting to go. They really, I mean, it was the right staff and they got a lot out of it, but there was a bit of a scrabble to be part of that that delegation. For obvious reasons, I did want to be as well, but I was banned because I wasn't going to add any value to but we do very actively share learning, particularly when we're moving on to new things that other people might have already done and got experience of, and you can learn the good and the where it can go wrong. So we do that a lot.
Thanks for a really great insight there, and Michael, I'm sure that's music to your ears as well. So as you pointed out, Fiona, we've just about hit our time limit, unfortunately, this morning. It's a discussion. I mean, like I was saying earlier, actually, there's a number of different strands of continue discussing, and there's a huge amount more detail to get into. But that's given us some great insight, I think, this morning in terms of the direction of travel for all of the regulators, and actually some real insight into some of the commonalities as well. I mean, it's interesting to see some of those kind of common themes in terms of where regulation is moving. I think that came across quite clearly this morning, particularly in terms of what the future might hold for society, for individuals, and what role that then means landlords and regulators might have, and how that might need to change the results. So lots of food for thought there. I think a huge amount we could also have continued to get into. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions in advance. But I think at this stage I will wrap up the formal proceedings, and it just remains to me to thank you all for giving up your time this morning and giving us an absolutely fascinating insight into where regulation is headed and what the year ahead might well hold. Thank you all very much, and thank you all very much for tuning in as well. Thank you.
Thank you.